The wind stopped completely, and in that eerie silence, Elijah Cartwright pushed open the trapdoor just enough to see what remained of his neighbor's cabin scattered across 3 acres of Kansas prairie. Below him, in the underground room, his children still gripped his hands, their breathing shallow, while above the world had been torn apart in less than 2 minutes. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Elijah Cartwright had survived 4 Kansas summers by the spring of 1859, and he believed he understood the prairie's dangers. Hailstorms that could kill livestock, droughts that cracked the earth into geometric patterns, winter blizzards that buried entire homesteads under drifts no man could dig through. These were the threats he had prepared for when he brought his wife Abigail and their 2 children west from Ohio in Avery's, 1855. His cabin stood on a quarter-section claim near the eastern edge of Kansas Territory, 16 feet by 20 feet of hand-hewn logs chinked with clay and prairie grass. It was a good cabin by frontier standards, tight enough to keep out wind and rain, warm enough to survive winter. His nearest neighbor was David Thornton, whose claim began a mile to the west. David had arrived 2 years after Elijah, bringing his wife Mary and 3 children from Pennsylvania. The 2 families helped each other during harvest, shared tools, and gathered for Sunday meals when weather permitted. David was 34 years old, 2 years younger than Elijah, competent with an axe and reliable in emergencies. Elijah considered him a genuine friend. On April 12, 1859, Elijah was working his south field, turning soil for corn planting. The day was unseasonably warm, with thick, humid air. Around 2 o'clock, he noticed the sky changing. Low gray clouds slid from the southwest, while higher clouds traveled the opposite direction. The air felt heavy and electric. Birds had gone silent. He heard the sound before he saw anything. It started as a low rumble, but grew rapidly into a roar that had no comparison. Elijah looked up and saw it a mile away, moving directly toward the Thornton property. The tornado was dark gray, almost black at its base, wider than any natural thing should be. Debris swirled around it in a halo of destruction. It moved with terrible speed across the prairie. The structure simply exploded. One moment the cabin existed. The next moment it was gone, replaced by a cloud of timber and household goods spinning in the vortex. The tornado passed over in seconds, then continued northeast, eventually lifting back into the clouds. The entire event took less than 3 minutes. Elijah ran, leaving his plow where it stood. He covered the mile in what felt like both seconds and hours. When he reached the Thornton property, devastation overwhelmed his ability to process it. The cabin was erased. Foundation stones remained, but everything above ground level had been scattered across 3 acres. Timbers were splintered into fragments. The stove had been thrown 50 yards away. He found David 30 yards from where the cabin had stood. A heavy timber had pierced through his chest. David had died instantly. His hand still gripped a door brace, a piece of oak beam he must have been holding when the tornado struck, attempting to reinforce the weakest point. Those hands, locked in their final desperate action, would haunt Elijah for the rest of his life. Mary Thornton and her 3 children survived the tornado by pure chance. They had been in the root cellar behind the cabin when the storm struck, gathering potatoes for the evening meal. The cellar was a simple pit lined with stones, covered by a wooden frame and sod roof. It was designed to keep vegetables cool, nothing more. But being 8 feet below ground level saved their lives. When they emerged into a world that no longer contained their home, Mary collapsed to her knees and wept. Elijah helped them gather what could be salvaged. They found clothing tangled in tree branches a quarter-mile away. They recovered cooking pots, tools, and a few pieces of furniture that had somehow survived intact. Mary's china tea set, a wedding gift she had carried from Pennsylvania, was completely gone. Elijah loaded the Thornton family into his wagon and brought them to his cabin. Abigail made space, prepared food, and spoke quietly to Mary while the children sat in shocked silence. David Thornton's funeral took place 3 days later on a hillside overlooking both properties. 27 settlers attended, traveling from scattered claims across the territory. The circuit preacher read from Psalms and spoke about God's mysterious ways. Neighbors offered condolences and practical help. Several men pledged assistance in rebuilding the Thornton cabin. Mary thanked them with hollow eyes. Elijah stood beside the grave, watching dirt fall onto the wooden coffin, and felt something crystallize inside him. This death was being treated as inevitable, an act of God that no man could prevent. But Elijah could not accept that. Over the following weeks, he began asking questions. He talked to every settler within 10 miles about their experiences with tornadoes and severe weather. Most had stories. Luther Grimes described a tornado that had passed within 100 yards of his cabin 2 years earlier. Charles Harwell had lost his first barn to straight-line winds. An older settler named Benjamin Pierce recalled 3 tornadoes he had witnessed during his 12 years in Kansas Territory. The common wisdom was consistent. If you saw a tornado approaching, you had 2 choices. Lie flat in the lowest ground you could find, preferably a ravine or ditch, or huddle in the strongest corner of your cabin. Both options relied entirely on luck. Elijah began examining destroyed structures, riding out to locations where cabins or barns had been damaged in previous years. The pattern was unmistakable. Tornadoes did not just damage buildings, they erased them. Walls were lifted off foundations, roofs were peeled away. Even heavy objects were thrown hundreds of yards. The only things that consistently survived were those below ground level. Foundation stones remained in place. Root cellars stayed intact. Wells were undamaged. He sat at his table one evening while Abigail mended clothes and the children slept. He pulled out paper and began sketching. The idea was simple. Build a room beneath the cabin floor, deep enough that no tornado could reach it. But as he drew, complications multiplied. How deep? How would you prevent collapse? How would you access it quickly? How would you breathe if trapped? Each question led to more questions. Elijah began his education by visiting every underground structure within 20 miles of his claim. He started with root cellars, examining how settlers had dug them, lined them, and kept them from collapsing. Most were crude affairs, simple pits with wooden frames and dirt roofs that leaked during heavy rain. But a few showed careful engineering. Benjamin Pierce had a root cellar 8 feet deep with stone-lined walls and a drainage channel that carried water away from the interior. Elijah spent an afternoon measuring dimensions, studying how Pierce had stacked the stones, noting the slight inward angle of the walls that made them self-supporting. He visited well diggers working on a new claim 15 miles south. These men understood earth and water better than anyone on the frontier. They explained how different soil types required different approaches. Clay held its shape but trapped water. Sandy soil drained well but collapsed easily. Rock was ideal for stability but brutal to excavate. They showed him how they prevented cave-ins using temporary wooden bracing that could be removed once stone lining was in place. They described the dangers: pockets of gas that could suffocate a man, underground water that could flood a shaft in minutes, walls that seemed stable but failed without warning. In Lawrence, a town 20 miles east, Elijah found a builder constructing a basement for a new hotel. This was formal construction, not frontier improvisation. The builder, a German immigrant named Friedrich Weber, was using techniques brought from Europe. Elijah watched for 2 days, asking questions until Weber grew annoyed, then intrigued by the frontier farmer's genuine interest. Weber explained load-bearing principles, how weight distributed across multiple support points prevented collapse. He demonstrated arch construction, showing how curved stone or timber could support far more weight than straight beams. He described the importance of ventilation in enclosed spaces. Elijah filled a notebook with sketches and measurements. He drew cross-sections of root, cellars, elevation views of well shafts, detailed drawings of timber bracing patterns. He calculated volumes and weights, estimating how much earth he would need to remove and how much timber would be required for support structures. He began purchasing materials that raised eyebrows among his neighbors. Heavy iron hinges that weighed 10 pounds each, brackets designed for structural support, seasoned oak lumber, expensive but resistant to rot, clay drainage tiles, canvas treated with pitch for waterproofing, square-cut nails by the pound. The total cost exceeded $60, more than most settlers spent on materials in an entire year. Luther Grimes saw Elijah loading supplies into his wagon at the Lawrence General Store. Luther was 43 years old, a settler who had claimed land the same year as Elijah. He had strong opinions about proper frontier behavior. "You planning to build a church, Cartwright?" Luther asked, examining the pile of iron hardware and finished lumber. Elijah secured the load with rope before answering. "Building something that needs to last," he said simply. Luther shook his head. "You're building a grave, not a shelter. All that money for a fancy hole you'll never use." He walked away. Elijah climbed onto his wagon and headed home. Explanation without demonstration was useless. Elijah began digging in early June of 1859. He chose to work during the coolest hours, starting before dawn and stopping when the sun grew too intense, then resuming in the evening after supper. The cabin measured 16 feet by 20 feet, and he planned the underground room to occupy the eastern half, creating a chamber 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 7 feet deep. He started by carefully removing floorboards from the designated area, numbering each plank so he could replace them in exact order once construction was complete. The earth beneath his cabin was dense Kansas clay, mixed with rocks ranging from pebble size to stones, weighing 20 pounds. Each shovelful required effort. He worked methodically, filling wooden buckets that Abigail hauled up using a rope system he rigged from the cabin's roof beams. The excavated soil had to be moved far enough from the cabin that it would not create suspicious mounds visible to neighbors. He spread it across his fields in thin layers, making it disappear into the landscape. Progress was slower than he had anticipated. After 1 week of dawn-to-dusk work, he had dug only 2 feet deep across the entire chamber footprint. His hands developed new calluses on top of old ones. His back ached constantly. Abigail watched him with concern, but said nothing, understanding that arguing would accomplish nothing once Elijah had committed to a course of action. Rebecca and Thomas thought the growing pit was fascinating, a giant hole appearing beneath their home. Elijah had to warn them repeatedly to stay back from the edge. By mid-July, he reached 5 feet deep and encountered bedrock. The limestone layer was exactly what he needed for foundation stability, but it created a new problem. He needed 7 feet of depth for adequate headroom, which meant excavating 2 more feet through solid rock. He purchased a heavy iron pry bar and a set of chisels in Lawrence, tools designed for quarry work. Breaking rock was different from digging soil. He had to identify natural fracture lines, drive chisels into cracks, and lever chunks free piece by piece. The work was loud, sending sharp metallic sounds echoing through the cabin. Each evening, his shoulders burned from swinging the hammer. He reached full depth in early August, 3 months after starting. The chamber was now a precise rectangular pit, 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, 7 feet deep, with bedrock floor and clay walls. Standing at the bottom, Elijah could barely see the cabin ceiling above him. The space felt simultaneously enormous and claustrophobic. Now came the engineering that would determine whether this hole became a shelter or simply an elaborate grave, as Luther Grimes had predicted. He began building the structural framework using techniques adapted from well construction and basement building. He set vertical timber posts at each corner, anchoring them to the bedrock using iron brackets and drilling directly into stone. Between corners, he placed additional posts every 3 feet, creating a grid of support columns. Each post was oak, 6 inches square, chosen for straightness and lack of knots. He checked every placement with a plumb line, ensuring perfect vertical alignment. The posts had to support not just the ceiling planks, but the entire weight of the cabin floor above, plus any furniture or people standing on it. Horizontal beams connected the vertical posts at the top, creating a rigid frame that would support the ceiling. Elijah notched each beam to lock into the posts, then reinforced every joint with iron brackets bolted through the wood. The brackets eliminated the risk of joints separating under load. He added diagonal braces running from corner posts to midpoint beams, forming triangular reinforcement patterns that prevented lateral movement. The framework took 2 weeks to complete, and when finished, it was strong enough that he could hang his full body weight from any beam without movement or creaking. The ceiling planks went on next. He used tongue and groove boards milled from dense pine, each plank 3 inches thick and fitted so tightly that light could not pass between them. The tongue and groove joints locked the planks together, making the ceiling function as a single solid surface. He nailed each plank to the beams using square-cut nails driven at angles for maximum holding strength. Over the planks, he stretched canvas that had been soaked in hot pitch, creating a waterproof membrane. The pitch smell filled the cabin for days. Over the canvas, he packed 6 inches of clay mixed with straw, forming an impermeable moisture barrier. The walls required different treatment. The clay earth wanted to slump inward, especially after rain. Below the frost line, approximately 3 feet deep, he stacked limestone rocks he had gathered from a nearby creek bed. The stones fit together like puzzle pieces, creating a solid barrier between earth and interior space. Above the stone layer, he installed vertical planking, placing boards tight against the clay walls. Between the planks and the earth, he packed clay mixed with straw, filling every gap and creating insulation that would keep the room temperature stable. Drainage was critical. Underground rooms could flood during heavy rain if water had nowhere to go. Elijah installed clay tiles at the base of each wall, angling them toward one corner where he had dug a sump pit 2 feet deeper than the main floor. Water seeping through the walls would run to the tiles, flow to the corner, and collect in the sump where it could be bailed out. He tested the system by pouring water against the walls and watching it drain exactly as designed. Ventilation required 2 pipes fabricated from sheet metal, creating tubes 4 inches in diameter. One pipe brought fresh air in, positioned low on one wall. The second pipe exhausted stale air, positioned high on the opposite wall. The pipes extended up through the cabin floor and connected to his stovepipe system, disguised as expansion joints. The arrangement created natural circulation. The trapdoor was his final component. He built it from 3-inch oak planks reinforced with iron straps bolted through the wood. The door measured 4 feet by 3 feet, large enough for an adult to pass through easily. He mounted it on heavy hinges, positioned so the door opened downward into the shelter. From inside, a wooden bar slid through iron brackets, locking the door against any impact from above. When closed, the trapdoor was nearly invisible, blending perfectly with the surrounding floorboards. Elijah completed the underground room in late August of 1859. He stocked it with supplies that would sustain his family if they were trapped for an extended period. 2 water barrels, each holding 10 gallons, sat against one wall. Dried meat wrapped in canvas occupied a shelf he had built into the stone wall section. Hardtack biscuits sealed in tin containers would remain edible for months. Blankets were rolled and stored in a wooden chest to keep them dry. 3 lanterns hung from ceiling hooks, with extra oil and matches stored in waterproof tins. He included a shovel and pry bar in case debris blocked the trapdoor and they needed to dig their way out. A chamber pot addressed the practical reality of extended shelter time. Medical supplies, bandages, and a bottle of whiskey for disinfecting wounds completed the preparations. He drilled his family on entry procedures every few days. When Elijah gave the signal, usually by simply saying "now," everyone stopped what they were doing and moved. Rebecca and Thomas knew to go down the ladder first. Abigail followed immediately. Elijah came last, closing and barring the trapdoor from below. In the beginning, the process was chaotic. Thomas was 6 years old and frightened of the dark underground space. He would hesitate at the ladder, and precious seconds were lost coaxing him down. Rebecca, 8 years old, complained about the musty smell and the cramped feeling of being underground. Abigail said nothing, but her face showed concern each time they practiced. Elijah remained patient. He explained repeatedly why speed mattered. Tornadoes gave little warning. The time between first sighting and impact could be measured in minutes or even seconds. If they were going to survive, everyone needed to move without thinking, without hesitation, operating on practiced memory rather than conscious decision. He timed each drill. The first attempt took 4 minutes from signal to secured door. Unacceptable. He made them practice again and again. By September, they could go from normal activity to fully sheltered in 90 seconds. Luther Grimes visited one afternoon and witnessed a drill. Elijah had been working in his vegetable garden when he noticed cloud formations that looked threatening. He called out to Abigail, who was hanging laundry. She immediately gathered the children from where they played near the cabin. All 4 disappeared inside. Luther, who had been riding past on his way to town, stopped his horse and watched with open curiosity. After several minutes, the Cartwright family emerged from the cabin, brushing dust from their clothes. Luther rode over to investigate. "What in God's name are you doing, Cartwright?" he asked. Elijah showed him the trapdoor, now closed and nearly invisible among the regular floorboards. Luther dismounted and examined it closely. He tested the hinges, noting their heavy construction. He tried to lift the door, but found it barred from below during their side. "Drill." "You've built a fancy hole in the ground that you'll never need," Luther said, straightening up. "And when you do need shelter, you'll be out in the fields like the rest of us, trusting God and luck." Elijah simply nodded. He had learned that demonstration convinced people more effectively than argument, and the real demonstration had not yet occurred. September of 1859 brought unusual weather patterns to eastern Kansas Territory. The oppressive summer heat did not break as it normally did with the approach of autumn. Instead, humid air masses stalled over the prairie, creating conditions that old-timers recognized as dangerous. The sky took on strange colors at sunset, deep purples and oranges that seemed unnatural. Morning fog lingered longer than it should. Animals behaved oddly. Horses grew skittish without apparent cause. Birds flew in erratic patterns or fell silent for hours at a time. Small tornadoes touched down in neighboring counties throughout early September. A funnel cloud destroyed a barn 15 miles south of Elijah's property, scattering lumber across 2 miles of prairie. Another tornado touched down briefly near Lawrence, damaging several buildings before lifting back into the clouds. These were not the massive destructive storms like the one that killed David Thornton, but they were warnings that atmospheric conditions remained volatile. Settlers began watching the sky with new attention. Conversations at the general store and after church services turned repeatedly to weather. Sunday services at the small church in Lawrence included prayers for protection from severe weather. The minister, a serious man named Reverend Howard, spoke about trusting in God's providence while also using the wisdom God provided. He did not specifically mention Elijah's underground shelter, but several people glanced in Elijah's direction during the sermon. The message was clear. Preparation was not a lack of faith, but rather an acceptance of responsibility. On September 23rd, Elijah was repairing fence line on the western edge of his property. The day had been hot and still, with air so thick it felt difficult to breathe. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he noticed the clouds. They were moving in contradictory directions. Low gray formations slid rapidly from the southwest, while higher white clouds traveled northeast. The contradiction created a rotating appearance, like giant gears turning against each other. The air pressure changed noticeably. His ears felt strange, a sensation similar to being underwater. Birds that had been calling fell completely silent. The wind, which had been steady all day, stopped entirely. Elijah dropped his tools and ran toward the cabin. He covered 200 yards in less than a minute. Abigail saw him coming from the cabin window. She knew immediately something was wrong. By the time he reached the door, she had already gathered Rebecca and Thomas from where they played near the vegetable garden. "Now," Elijah said quietly, but firmly. The single word triggered the drill they had practiced dozens of times. Rebecca moved to the trapdoor and opened it smoothly. She descended the ladder quickly, her hands finding each rung automatically. Thomas followed without hesitation. Abigail went next, gathering her skirts to navigate the ladder safely. Elijah took one final look outside, saw the sky darkening to an unnatural greenish-gray, then descended and pulled the trapdoor closed above him. The wooden bar slid into place with a solid thunk. In the underground room, he lit a lantern. The flame caught immediately, casting steady light across stone walls and timber supports. Above them, the wind began to roar. The tornado passed directly over Elijah's property. In the underground room, the family experienced it as sound and pressure changes that seemed to come from all directions simultaneously. The roar started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it grew, within seconds, into something that had no comparison in their experience. It was not wind as they understood wind. It was a continuous explosion, a sound so loud and pervasive that it seemed to come from inside their own bodies rather than from above. The cabin shuddered. They felt vibrations through the stone walls, through the packed earth, through the bedrock itself. Dust sifted down from gaps between the ceiling planks, creating thin streams in the lantern light. Rebecca pressed against Abigail's side, her hands covering her ears. Thomas buried his face in his mother's chest, his small body shaking. Abigail held both children, her own fear controlled but visible in the tightness around her eyes. Elijah stood near the ladder, one hand on the wooden supports, feeling the structure respond to the forces above. The timber posts creaked but held. The ceiling planks flexed slightly but remained intact. The iron brackets showed no movement. Everything was performing exactly as he had designed it to perform. The pressure changes were severe. Their ears popped repeatedly, painful enough to make Thomas cry out. The air itself felt different, thinner, harder to breathe. The lantern flame flickered wildly, bending horizontal in response to pressure differentials, but it did not go out. They heard impacts above them, heavy thuds as debris struck the cabin or the ground nearby. Something massive hit the roof directly over their shelter. The sound was like a cannon firing. Rebecca screamed. The ceiling held. Elijah counted seconds, trying to estimate the storm's duration. At 30 seconds, the roar was at its peak, so loud that he could not hear his own voice when he tried to speak reassurance to his family. At 60 seconds, the quality of the sound began to change, shifting from the continuous roar to a more intermittent howling. At 90 seconds, he could distinguish individual sounds within the chaos: breaking timber, objects being dragged across ground, the higher-pitched whistle of wind through narrow gaps. At 2 minutes, the apocalyptic roar diminished to merely deafening wind. At 2 minutes 30 seconds, rain began, heavy and loud but normal, almost comforting in its familiarity. Elijah wanted to wait longer to ensure the tornado had truly passed and not simply paused. They sat in the underground room for another 10 minutes, listening to rain drum against what remained of the cabin above them. The children's breathing slowly returned to normal. Abigail loosened her grip on them. The immediate terror faded, replaced by uncertainty about what they would find when they emerged. Finally, Elijah pushed up on the trapdoor. It opened smoothly, the hinges undamaged. He climbed the ladder and stepped into destruction. Rain fell through open sky where roof should have been. One wall was pushed outward, separated from its corner joints. The door was gone. Windows were shattered. Furniture was overturned and scattered. But the cabin still stood, and his family was alive. He reached down through the trap door to help Abigail and the children up into their damaged but surviving home. The Cartwright family emerged from the underground room into a world that had been violently rearranged. Rain fell steadily through the torn sections of roof, creating puddles on the cabin floor. Elijah's carefully built structure had survived, but barely. The western wall leaned outward at a noticeable angle, its corner joints stressed beyond their original design. Half the roof was gone, shingles and support beams scattered across the property. The stone fireplace stood intact, one of the few elements completely undamaged. Furniture was overturned. Cooking pots, tools, and household items lay scattered in chaotic patterns. But compared to what Elijah saw when he looked beyond his cabin, the damage was minimal. Luther Grimes' cabin, half a mile to the west, was completely destroyed. Where a structure had stood that morning, only foundation, Stones remained. The logs that had formed walls were scattered across 300 yards of prairie. The roof was nowhere to be seen. As Elijah stared at the devastation, he saw movement near the ruins. People were emerging from the ravine that ran behind where Luther's cabin had stood. Luther appeared first, helping his wife Clara climb up the muddy bank. Their 2 children followed, and then Luther's eldest son, a boy of 14. They were alive but injured. Even from a distance, Elijah could see they moved stiffly, favoring various limbs. Elijah told Abigail to keep the children inside the damaged cabin. Then he ran toward the Grimes property. As he got closer, the extent of their injuries became clear. Clara had a deep cut across her forehead, blood mixing with rain on her face. One of the children, a girl of about 10, held her arm at an unnatural angle. Luther himself was limping severely, his left leg barely supporting his weight. They had survived by lying flat in the ravine. When they saw the tornado approaching, exactly the survival method that conventional wisdom recommended. They were alive, but the experience had been brutal. Debris had fallen on them. They had been pelted by hail and rain. The terror of lying exposed while the tornado passed overhead had left them shaking and disoriented. Charles Harwell appeared from the east, also running toward the Grimes family. His barn was destroyed, visible as scattered lumber behind him. He had a broken arm, roughly splinted with a board and strips of cloth. Other settlers began arriving as the rain diminished. Everyone converged on the Grimes property because the destruction there was most complete. People shared information quickly. 3 settlers were dead, killed when their cabins collapsed. A dozen more were injured with varying severity. More than half the buildings in the scattered settlement were damaged or destroyed. Someone noticed that Elijah's cabin, though damaged, was still standing. Someone else pointed out that the Cartwright family showed no injuries. Luther Grimes, sitting on a foundation stone while his wife bandaged his leg, looked toward Elijah with an expression that mixed pain, exhaustion, and dawning realization. "Your underground room," Luther said, his voice rough. "You were in it." Elijah nodded. "My family was safe," he said simply. Luther stared at him for a long moment, then looked at his own injured family, then back at Elijah. "Show me how you built it," Luther said. "Show me everything." Over the following weeks, settlers came to Elijah's property in a steady stream. They examined the underground room with careful attention, measuring dimensions, studying the timber framework, asking detailed questions about construction methods. Elijah answered every question completely and honestly. He sketched diagrams showing post placement, beam connections, drainage systems, and ventilation arrangements. He explained the principles behind his decisions, the load-bearing calculations, the waterproofing techniques, the importance of the locking bar that could be operated from inside. He offered to help anyone who wanted to build similar protection for their families. By December of 1859, 7 families had begun construction on underground shelters. Some followed Elijah's design exactly. Others modified it based on their specific situations or available materials. A family with a larger cabin built a room that could accommodate 8 people. Another settler with limited resources built a smaller chamber, only 6 feet deep, but still adequate for protection. Charles Harwell designed his shelter with a secondary exit tunnel leading 20 feet from the main chamber, providing an escape route if the primary entrance became blocked. The tornado season of 1860 proved worse than the previous year. Between April and September, 11 confirmed tornadoes touched down in eastern Kansas Territory. 3 were massive storms, comparable to the one that killed David Thornton. But this time, families who had built underground shelters survived events that would have killed them. Charles Harwell's shelter saved his family when a tornado destroyed his rebuilt cabin in May. They emerged from underground to find their home erased, but themselves uninjured. Luther Grimes survived a June storm that passed directly over his property. His new cabin was destroyed, but his family spent the storm safe underground. Word of the underground shelter technique spread beyond Kansas Territory. Settlers moving into Nebraska and eastern Colorado heard stories about the rooms that tornadoes could not reach. Builders began incorporating storm cellars as standard features in new homesteads. The designs evolved over time. Some families added multiple rooms for storage and shelter. Others built entirely separate structures, mounding earth over timber frames to create dedicated tornado refuges. By 1865, the practice was common enough that newcomers to the region asked about storm shelter construction as routinely as they asked about well digging. Elijah continued farming his land and never sought recognition for what he had created. When people thanked him, he simply said it was necessary. The image of David Thornton, dead from a preventable tragedy, remained with him always. He rebuilt his cabin with the same careful attention he had used on the shelter. In 1873, Elijah died at age 58 from pneumonia. His obituary in the Lawrence newspaper mentioned his farm and his family, but made no reference to the shelter design that had saved dozens of lives. Rebecca and Thomas, now adults with families of their own, maintained their father's property. They taught their children how the shelter worked, passing down not just the technique, but the principle behind it, that accepting preventable death was resignation, not strength. The shelter built in 1859 remained, functional into the 1880s. In Kansas counties where Elijah's technique had spread, families still referred to underground storm shelters as Cartwright doors, commemorating a man who refused to accept that survival should depend on luck.